Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this live town hall meeting on Catholic TV and simulcast on radio here in Boston on 1060 AM WQOM. My name is John Monahan. This special town hall meeting is being convened by Cardinal Sean O'Malley, Archbishop of Boston, as part of the educational campaign on physician-assisted suicide. On November 6, 2012, Massachusetts residents will vote on a statewide ballot question, Question 2, which would legalize physician-assisted suicide. Question 2 proposes to allow a patient who's been diagnosed with a terminal illness and given a prognosis of less than 6 months to live the ability to request a lethal prescription to end his or her life. If passed on Election Day, physician-assisted suicide would become legal under Massachusetts law in January. No additional legislative or approvals would be needed. During this broadcast, we'll examine the concerns expressed about Question 2 from the perspectives of doctors and nurses, palliative care and hospice providers, disabilities advocates, and of the Catholic faith. We'll also discuss the main reasons articulated by the proponents of Question 2 and hear our panelists respond to those. Joining Cardinal Sean on our panel are M.C. Sullivan, the Director of Ethics at Covenant Health Systems. M.C. is a nurse, bioethicist, and an attorney. Dr. John Howland, a family physician who founded an organization called Doctors Against Suicide. He serves as the New England Regional Director of the Catholic Medical Organization. Janet Benestad, the point person for the Archdiocese of Boston's educational efforts on Question 2. And Father Tad Pacholczyk, who earned a PhD in neuroscience from Yale before his ordination as a priest of the Diocese of Fall River. Father Tad currently serves as the Director of Education at the National Catholic Bioethics Center. We want to thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll take questions from both those in our studio audience who come from across the Archdiocese of Boston, and also from all of those taking part through television and radio. You can submit your questions via Facebook, Twitter, or email to townhall@catholictv.com. And we thank those that have already sent in their questions. Now I'll invite Cardinal Sean to begin our town hall meeting.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this town hall meeting. On November the 6th, Massachusetts voters will cast ballots on Question 2. The Archdiocese of Boston is part of a broad-based coalition of doctor and nurse associations, disability advocates, and palliative care and hospice groups who are trying to stop assisted suicide by encouraging a no vote on Question 2. The ballot question presents perhaps the gravest threat to the dignity of life in the Commonwealth in recent memory. The proponents of this question view Massachusetts as a gateway to the rest of the country. It's imperative that we halt this effort here and now. We face many challenges in this campaign, which is why I'm grateful for your participation this evening and why I'm asking for your help between now and November the 6th. The first challenge is that the proponents of the bill have framed the language voters will see. Proponents deliberately avoid the word suicide. Voters will be asked to support a so-called death with dignity. Well, who wouldn't want a dignified death? Unfortunately, this is a euphemism meant to mask the reality. Doctors providing a prescription for someone with a terminal diagnosis of 6 months or less to end his or her own life. It's important that we, all of us, help people to understand what Question 2 is really about. The second challenge is that we have only 34 days until the election. The vast majority of Massachusetts voters have still not heard about the issue. Generally, that lack of information will favor the yes side of the campaign. So it's important that everyone in this state hear about this issue over the next 5 weeks. And we need your help to do that. You will hear tonight about many reasons to oppose Question 2. Generally, there are 3 categories of reasons to oppose this ballot initiative. First, there are those groups like us who think that physician-assisted suicide is simply a terrible idea based on the value of human life, the values of the medical profession, and the legitimate fears of those in the disability community. These groups believe there are better and more compassionate ways to care for those at the end of life, such as hospice and palliative care, and the loving support of family members. This group needs support and affirmation in their position. Second, there are those who might be in favor of assisted suicide generally, but oppose question 2 because they think a complex issue like this should never be decided by a balloted question, dominated by 30-second commercials and the absence of vigorous debate. It would be much better to have the legislature study, debate, and vote on this kind of issue. And third, there are those that are opposed to question 2 because of the significantly flawed way the bill is written. Some of the flaws are that terminally diagnosed people often live much longer than the doctors tell them. There's no requirement here to consult a psychiatrist or palliative care expert, or even to inform family members before receiving a lethal prescription. We should be improving palliative care and hospice care and not providing access to lethal drugs. It's important that our people hear all 3 categories of reasons to oppose question 2. I look forward to your questions and our discussion this evening.
Cardinal Sean, thank you very much. We'll hear now from our panelist, MC Sullivan. She's a nurse and director of ethics at Covenant Health Systems. MC will address some of the concerns about question 2 from the medical community. Good evening, MC.
Thank you, John. As Cardinal Sean has said, the whole question of assisted suicide is one that demands a rigorous, informed public debate. To do otherwise, for example, to blindside voters as they enter the polling places next month, is to trivialize an extremely important issue. Voters on November 6th will face a very specific initiative in question 2. It presents a proposition that I believe has serious flaws. Those flaws are the lack of very necessary patient protections, and without those protections, the law that comes from this initiative is one that is ripe for abuse. If question 2 passes, there will be a dramatic change in the culture of healthcare, one in which the healing arts and the healing professionals will see assisted suicide as a legal and routine way to care for the terminally ill. Since when is the deliberate causing of death seen as care? Is that what we want as a society? Disability groups and disease advocacy groups certainly don't. They have long expressed their opposition to this proposal. The American Medical Association has as well. Here in our Commonwealth, the Massachusetts Medical Society has also issued a statement opposing question 2. Their statement points to the lack of sufficient safeguards to protect patients, as they argue that assisted suicide doesn't improve the quality of life at the end of life, and that the values of the medical profession are clear that doctors should not participate in assisted suicide. There's a fundamental distinction between intentionally choosing to cause death by writing a prescription for lethal drugs and choosing to provide comfort, even if those comfort measures unintentionally hasten death. Physicians throughout time have used the healing arts to relieve pain. Prescribing medication for the sole purpose of ending life has no place in the work of doctors, nurses, and caregivers. Let me point out for just a minute some of the inherent and extremely problematic deficiencies with this bill. First, it allows a person who's diagnosed to have 6 months or less to live to request physician-assisted suicide. As any healthcare provider knows, it's virtually impossible to accurately predict a timeline to someone's death. Those physicians who have done so have seen patients outlive their predictions, sometimes by years. And of course, the predictions can be equally wrong in the other direction. Second, there's no requirement for the requesting patient to have a psychiatric evaluation. All of us who have worked with dying patients have empirically observed that for significant numbers of patients, depression is part of the experience of terminal or chronic illness. And now NIH research has documented that fact. We also know that with proper therapeutic intervention, depression can be successfully treated and suicide rates fall. Third, any serious decision in healthcare requires informed consent by a person declared to have the capacity to make that decision. With this initiative, we're talking about an ultimate and irreversible act, and yet there is no requirement for family involvement or even notification, or that someone who knows the patient enough to know whether she or he has the decision-making capacity actually be involved in the process. Even the witnesses that the initiative does call for do not have to know the patient. It only stipulates that at least one of the witnesses does not stand to gain from the patient's death. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the whole premise of this referendum is that the pain and suffering of terminal illness have become unbearable. Yet there's no requirement for a palliative care consultation. Palliative care is the only proper response to this initiative. It is the preferred and specialized clinical method of treatment in serious, chronic, and terminal illness. Palliative care is a patient-centered approach that treats all of the different aspects of pain and suffering. It is a multidisciplinary approach where teams of professionals treat the physical and physiological symptoms of pain and discomfort, as well as the mental anguish, the emotional distress, and the spiritual agony that constitute the non-physical suffering of the terminally ill. At this point in 21st century America, every single healthcare facility knows about palliative care. Our job is to expect it, to request it, to demand it for our loved ones, our patients, and ourselves. The thing about this referendum that I find most offensive is that it's the lazy way out. Rather than ending a life that is filled with pain and suffering, our responsibility as physicians, as nurses and other caregivers, as family members, is to work and work hard to alleviate the pain and diminish the suffering, to assist loved ones and our patients to make the very most of the end of lifetime. That's how we show compassion. That's how we show respect. And that's how we restore patients' dignity to their dying.
MC, thank you. That concludes our opening statements. We're now ready to ask the panelists to respond to questions submitted by viewers tonight or over the past week. Here's our format. We'll have 3 segments. First, we'll ask the panel to address general questions and the main concerns expressed by the medical community, by disabilities advocates, and by our Catholic faith about assisted suicide. The second segment will involve questions related to concerns expressed about the flaws in the way question 2 is written. And the third segment will be about arguments made by proponents and the responses of the panel to those. Questions that you submit will be grouped into these 3 categories and shared with the panel. You can submit your questions to the Catholic TV team through Facebook, Twitter, or by emailing us at townhall@catholictv.com. We'll take a short break right now and be back after these messages with our first discussion segment. You're watching Catholic TV. Welcome back to this special town hall meeting on assisted suicide and question 2 on the November ballot. I'm John Monahan. In recent months, more than 30 organizations have joined a coalition called the Committee Against Physician-Assisted Suicide. It includes doctors, nurses, and palliative care organizations. And what they all say is that assisted suicide goes against the values of the medical profession. It also includes disabilities groups that fear question 2 would have results here similar to other places where assisted suicide is legal and would send the signal that some people with a perceived perceived lesser quality of life might be better off dead. There are also many faith organizations like the Catholic Church that believe assisted suicide, like all suicide, is a tragedy and an affront against the dignity of all human life. In this segment, we'll consider three questions about all three of those perspectives. Let's get started, and we'll direct our first question to Dr. John Howland. Dr. Howland is a family physician. Doctor, what are your concerns about how the legalization of assisted suicide would affect the medical profession and the doctor-patient relationship?
As you said, John, I'm a family doc, and I find it horrifying that we're even having to discuss this issue. As a family physician, to even consider the possibility that I might write a prescription to kill a patient is so overwhelmingly strange from my profession and point of view. My role as a doctor is to try to help heal the sick, not to end their lives. I hope desperately that we don't go this road, because it would be very destructive to the medical profession.
MC, do you want to weigh in on that?
I can only second what John has said. It runs counterculture to what we call the healing arts and professions.
Okay. Question for Father Tad, if I may. Father Tad, do you fear that if assisted suicide passes here in the Commonwealth, that it will lead to more suicides in the general population?
That's certainly possible. I think the kind of devaluation of life that is implied by an initiative like this is likely to have lateral effects like that. People will approach life with a more casual and kind of less circumspect vantage point. So I think the whole notion of the sacredness of human life is something that's under heavy challenge today. And this notion that we've received our lives as a gift, and in receiving it as a gift that we have certain duties and responsibilities, I'm afraid we're losing kind of touch with that. We're exaggerating this sense of autonomy. My life is my own. I should be able to do whatever I please with it. And whenever we do that, we kind of separate ourselves from the rest of the community. It becomes just an act of our own autonomy, our own selfishness at times. So I do think that passage of something like this would have those kinds of effects of kind of cheapening the value of life across the board, confusing people in general about end-of-life issues, and raising some very significant moral concerns along the way.
Is there evidence of this in other states or other countries?
Well, John, the World Health Organization that studies suicide in the whole world has urged governments never to use suicide or present it as a solution to a problem, because that will only encourage more suicides in society. And of course, Oregon is one of the states with the highest suicide rate in the country, and it's not the example we want to be following here in Massachusetts.
Okay, thank you. We have a question now from our viewers. I think this one is from Facebook. If we can put that up. This question is from Linda, and it says, how does assisted suicide differ from euthanasia? This is open to anyone on the panel.
Well, certainly assisted suicide is a means of assisting somebody to typically carry out the act themselves, while euthanasia often implies that it could be something carried out by the physician on behalf of the patient. The patient requests a lethal injection, for example. And euthanasia, per se, is legal in the Netherlands and has had catastrophic effects there. It, in a sense, follows in the train of physician-assisted suicide. We have seen recent statistical studies there that indicate that a number of the deaths that occur in the Netherlands occur through what's called involuntary euthanasia, where the people who are euthanized have not even requested it, but the doctors take it upon themselves to carry out this deed.
Okay, we have another question from a viewer, this one coming in from Twitter. This question says, it's from John, what limit is there on pain medications for Catholics? Is there anything, Father, Dr. John?
Yeah, that's a very important question, especially when we're thinking about the end of life and terminal illness, patients suffering from cancer with terrible pain. And there are no limits to the use of pain medication for Catholics or anyone at the end of life. As a physician treating many patients with cancer in their final days and weeks, I don't hesitate to use pain medicine to bring comfort to them. Ironically, you would think that the reason for wanting assisted suicide is to reduce the problem of pain at the end of life, but that's rarely why people ask for assisted suicide in those places where it's legal. Pain is not the issue.
Okay, let me ask a question that brings this idea to the doctor-patient relationship, and I'll pose this to you, Janet, if I may. It's often stated by proponents that this issue is between the patient seeking to end his or her life and their doctor. But how does it impact others beyond the patient and the doctor?
Oh, it impacts the patient's family dramatically. And as Cardinal Sean and MC have said, this law allows a patient to make a decision like this without consulting the family. In fact, the law includes the written request that the patient will make to the physician. And that written request says, I have notified my family and I have consulted with them and taken their opinions into account. I have not notified my family. I do not have a family to consult. And the patient must check one of those three things. The physician may not refuse the lethal medication, lethal prescription, we shouldn't call it medication, even if the patient says, I have not notified my family or I have no family to notify. He may not refuse the prescription, even though it's his responsibility to recommend that the patient notify the family. So this is a very difficult situation for a person to be in, to be making a decision like this on his own or on her own after having just received such a diagnosis.
Okay, Cardinal Sean, you want to weigh in?
The experience in Oregon is that most doctors won't do this. So people typically gravitate to the few doctors that become like Dr. Kevorkian and are pushing suicide. So these are doctors that don't even have a relationship with the patient and are simply there because philosophically they're in favor of suicide and make their services available to the patients. But the ordinary physician doesn't want any part of it. So people have to shop around, and then you have two tiers of medical service, those who are involved in caring for the patients and those whose specialty is eliminating the patient.
And Cardinal Sean, go ahead, MC.
Just one comment about both of these comments. You know, we spoke about some of the problems with this law. What we didn't say very bluntly is that the romanticized notion of a patient just kind of drifting off ought to be replaced by what the reality is without the safeguards in place in this initiative, which is that this can be a very isolating experience for patients. The distinction that Father Tad made about euthanasia or assisted suicide, there is no requirement that anybody be there to witness the actual assisted suicide, which again is making a law that's really ripe for abuse.
Right.
But it's the isolation of patients at a time when they should be surrounded by loved ones, involved loved ones, engaged in their care.
Well, that brings me to the idea that you were talking about too, Cardinal. I want to follow up with what you were saying, and it plays into what MC said about the idea of compassion. Proponents say that this is a compassionate way for a doctor to deal with a patient at the end of life. But what's your response to that?
Well, my response is helping someone commit suicide is not compassionate. Compassion is accompanying people in their moments of fear and pain and trying to use all of our modern medical technology to relieve their pain and to allow them to die naturally. I'm not talking about prolonging life unnaturally using all kinds of apparatuses when it's obvious that a person is at death's door. But there's a difference between allowing someone to die and killing them. And killing them does not respect their dignity and is certainly not a compassionate way to deal with the terminally ill.
Okay, and Father Tad, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think that this notion of compassion, it's kind of a loaded word, and it's being, in a sense, pirated away from us. Because, I mean, if you look at the Latin roots of it, it's from cum passionem, to suffer with somebody. And true compassion means that. It means your bedside. It's there. You're with the person. You're holding their hand. You're praying with them. You're accompanying them on a very difficult journey, a journey that all of us will have to make one day. And I think we can't allow for this term to be kind of stolen from us and transmuted into something that it isn't, where high doses of lethal substances become a substitute for true compassion accompanying people on that journey.
The term mercy killing is a euphemism that was invented in Nazi Germany when they began killing retarded children, disabled people, the elderly. So you can use beautiful words for very ugly acts.
And MC, let me put this question to you real briefly. People fear that process, and that's a reason proponents say this is something that should be legalized. But they don't have to because of the medication out there and the palliative care. Can you give us some insight?
I can. The technologies and the sophistication of pharmacology that we have at our disposal today really, as John said a few moments ago, can dispense with the worst pain that we can imagine that patients suffer.
Okay.
And we need to avail ourselves with it. But most patients will tell you, as John said, it's not the physical pain so much. It's the suffering. It's the mental and the emotional and the psychological anguish of separation, of feeling different, of impending departure. Okay. That is where walking the walk and suffering with our loved ones come in.
Okay. Obviously a lot to be said about this. We have to take a break right now. We'll be right back to follow up with some more. We'll be back in a moment to hear our panelists consider what flaws they see in the way question 2 is written. Stay with us.
Most of you won't recognize me or my real name. It's Norma McCourty. I'm also known as Jane Roe, the plaintiff in the Supreme Court case, Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion in America and changed our nation in an unprecedented way. Back in 1973, I was a very confused 21-year-old with one child and facing an unplanned pregnancy. At the time, I fought to obtain a legal abortion, but the truth be told, I have 3 daughters and have never had an abortion. However, upon knowing God, I realized that my case, which legalized abortion on demand, was the biggest mistake of my life. You see, abortion has eliminated 50 million innocent babies in the U.S. alone since 1973. Abortion scars an untold number of post-abortive mothers, fathers, and families too. You read about me in history books, but now I'm dedicated to spreading the truth about preserving the dignity of all human life, from natural conception to natural death.
Welcome back to Catholic TV's special town hall meeting. We're examining the issue of assisted suicide, which Massachusetts voters will consider on ballot question 2 in November. The Committee Against Physician-Assisted Suicide represents many medical and disability organizations. It has called question 2 a flawed law and a false choice, and it points to 6 significant flaws in question 2, flaws that it believes even those generally in favor of assisted suicide would find troubling. First, this coalition states that terminal diagnoses of 6 months or less are often wrong. Second, that it's troubling that someone requesting assisted suicide is not required to consult with a palliative care expert for pain management or required to see a psychiatrist if they think the patient is capable of making this decision and decide that, or if they're suffering from depression or a psychiatric disorder that would impair their judgment. Third, it states that no doctor needs to be present when the patient takes the lethal prescription. The fourth point, that there is no requirement for a patient to notify family members. 5, that there is no safeguard to protect the medicine from getting into the wrong hands. And the 6th point, that it works against what should be the compassionate way to care for those at the end of life, joining to support improved palliative and hospice care statewide. So let's direct our first question to Father Tad. Father, why is this lack of mandatory psychiatric examination before someone receives this prescription so troubling to the medical community, specifically those involved in mental health?
Well, because it's well known that those who request suicide frequently do have mental health concerns. There is a need for proper assessment ahead of time. The statistics on those who actually commit suicide are rather disturbing. You know, in the general public, that if you have schizophrenia, you have that in that population, it's an 8-fold elevated risk of committing suicide, and patients with depression have a 20-fold elevated risk of committing suicide. So it just makes sense that if one were to have an initiative of this sort, that there should at least be a requirement, a firm requirement, that these conditions be ruled out ahead of time so that people are not asking in kind of a haze or a fog from depression for something that they would later regret, because there are many stories of people who are treated pharmacologically for clinical depression. After the depression lifts, they say, oh, well, of course I didn't want suicide. You know, I was depressed at that point. So this should be something that any sensible person would see at a bare minimum as a kind of safeguard. You know, prescinding for the moment from the root moral objectionability of the entire proposal itself.
Okay. And a question now for Dr. John Holland. You're a family physician, doctor. How do you accurately consider terminal diagnoses of 6 months? Are they on target or not?
I get asked a lot, Doc, how long do I have? And it's the question I hate to get because I can't answer it. And I never tell someone you have 6 months to live because my guess is invariably inaccurate. And I remember vividly a woman who had breast cancer, and I saw her in the emergency room. She came in acutely ill, cyanotic. I thought she was going to die within a day. We transferred her to a tertiary care hospital, and I thought I would see the last of her at that. I never heard anything about what happened to her, and 2 years later, she walked into my office, and I about fell over. So I try to avoid trying to figure out when people are going to die. That's not my job. My job is to try to help care for people.
Right. And like dealing with people with psychiatric problems, there was a similar story in Oregon about a woman who was diagnosed with less than 6 months to live, and she lived for several years after that. So they really, they're not accurate.
And the tragedy is that when people think that they only have a certain number of months to live, they often lose out on tremendous opportunities. And those who take their lives prematurely have lost opportunities to spend time with family, to resolve things in their life, problems with relationships that need time, that dying process to work out. That's a precious time that we all need.
Janet, you'd like to add something?
That woman in Oregon is named Jeanette Hall. Jeanette Hall had voted for assisted suicide in Oregon. She was diagnosed with a terminal illness, went to her doctor, and asked for assisted suicide for a prescription to end her life. Her doctor happened to be a gentleman named Ken Stevens, who has become a great advocate to prevent assisted suicide. He said to her, no, we are going to treat this, recommended treatment, and many years later she is still alive to tell the story and living a rather productive life. So it is very important for us to understand that the diagnoses can be inaccurate, and they can be inaccurate in many ways, and that people go on to live very, very good lives even after those terminal diagnoses. I had a wonderful conversation with a hospice nurse this morning who told me about people who leave hospice, and that is often an experience, that those who are told they have a terminal illness and they choose hospice care do so well in hospice that they find themselves going home and sometimes living quite a while.
Okay, I want to involve the studio audience. Let me ask this woman about, please say your name, where you're from, and please pose your question.
My name is Elizabeth Lee. I'm from North Dayton, Massachusetts. And I just wanted to ask the question of how we see assisted suicide by physicians as okay, but on the other hand, when we have people with the probability of jumping off a bridge or jumping off of a building, we had the Good Samaritans out there always available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to help these people see how suicide is wrong. How could we say in one realm that suicide is okay, and on the other question say that suicide is not okay? I'd like to open that up to
Interesting question that I think firefighters and policemen face all the time, and you're right. Is there some kind of a contradiction here?
Elizabeth has put her finger on the great inconsistency of this public policy move. We have celebrated, as Cardinal Sean said, the WHO has reported a fall in the statistics of suicide, and we've celebrated that. What kind of message are we sending, particularly to our young people, where we haven't seen the fall in depression-related suicides. We've actually seen an increase. What kind of mixed message, terribly mixed message, irresponsibly mixed message are we sending to people? You've put your finger on the paradox of this whole initiative.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree as well. It seems to me that we really expend a lot of efforts. We have suicide hotlines. We have people who walk bridges and tall buildings trying to talk people down. We all say it's obviously something we shouldn't be doing here. And now we're sending, if we're going to allow physicians to prescribe lethal doses of drugs, we're sort of turning that upside down. And it's almost as if, you know, some of the signs that we put onto bridges where we discourage people from jumping, we're saying instead, consult with your physician to see whether jumping might be right. You know, I mean, it's an absurdity, it's a contradiction, and we should not be engaging in it on any level. And, you know, you mentioned, John, about firefighters and policemen and how there's kind of a sense of inconsistency here. And I think there really is. There's a way in which this whole thing is being placed onto the shoulders of the medical profession. But the question is, why, if this is something that's ever good to do, why should only the medical profession be a part of this? Why should it be physician-assisted suicide? Why not police-assisted suicide? Where you could have a policeman be called, he arrives with a firearm, he sets it up, he puts bullets in the chamber, he cocks it, he puts it on the bed next to the sick patient. He describes the best angle to direct the barrel, and then he walks out of the room. So now we have police-assisted suicide. And you can see we can go in other directions here. I mean, you could have situations like assisted drowning, and then you have lifeguards who their duty is to place millstones around people who want to end their life. I mean, it gets ridiculous in a sense, but I think it calls us to ask the root question here. Is suicide ever a reasonable kind of action? It certainly, most certainly, is not. It represents a violation of who we are, of some of our most deeply ingrained drives as humans for survival. And is always something fundamentally disordered and harmful to us, to those around us, and to society at large.
You put it in some interesting terms. Cardinal?
Any family that has experienced a suicide knows how painful it is. And in these situations, I can imagine that someone choosing assisted suicide, how that will divide the family. Some who may be in favor of this, others against. And the guilt that they'll have afterwards, it makes the whole family at times an accomplice in this suicide. It's just a terrible policy.
Something to consider. We have a question from somebody at home, this one via email. Let's take a look. This is from Roger. The question is, how does this bill affect doctors and nurses? So you touched on that a little bit, Father Tad, but anyone else care to comment? MC?
Within the language of the bill, there is a provision for doctors and nurses and facilities to opt out. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. It should be there. The problem that we have seen with the conscience clause is that it becomes a political football. And this question has already become highly politicized by virtue of it being a referendum initiative. So I fear that if this bill were to be passed, then we would end up with the same political football as the conscience clause has been treated in other situations, particularly abortion.
I'd like to add, MC.
Yeah.
We've all heard stories about nurses or doctors who've taken into their own hands to take patients' lives. And those stories are horrifying because those professionals who are supposed to be helping patients have crossed a line and are harming patients. And what this bill would do is cross the line for our profession and fundamentally change the nature of what it means to be a healthcare professional. And that will have very dangerous long-term effects.
I agree.
Another audience member's up. If you could tell us your name, sir, where you're from, and please pose your question.
Sure. My name is Tim Van Dam. I'm from Arlington, Mass. I have sort of a two-part question. The first is, I've often heard that physician-assisted suicide is sort of on par with abortion. You just mentioned abortion, that this is sort of with the scale of lives at risk and how this could multiply, that this could be the same scale there. So that's the first piece to open up. The second is Massachusetts specifically. I understand that Massachusetts has been specifically targeted for this bill because of the medical community here as being a leader in the world. And so maybe we could just sort of talk about the parallels to abortion and also why Massachusetts and what's the significance of Massachusetts.
Anyone on the panel want to address that specifically?
We can address the issue of why Massachusetts. In 2008, the state of Washington enacted assisted suicide by virtue of a ballot initiative, just as we have now in Massachusetts. And the public relations firm that conducted that campaign said that the best place to do this again would be a blue state, a state that is likely to vote Democratic, with a popular Democratic president running. So Massachusetts was targeted for political reasons, and I think also for the reasons you mentioned, that this is a medical center. And so, as Cardinal Sean says, this would be a gateway to other states if it were to pass here, which is why we have to stop it here.
You know, and we're talking about a lot of different troubling issues surrounding this, and something that came up, a question that really I thought was, just blew me away, was, I guess, MC, I'll pose this to you. If this does pass, a person can go to their neighborhood CVS and pick up this prescription. Is that true?
That's exactly right. This
how does
prescription
that
will
happen?
be dispensed. It's quite astounding, really. I'm sure CVS and Walgreens and all of the other pharmacies are in horror about this. But if you look at the language, and people can see it on the sample initiative that is waiting for them at their polling place, this prescription can be transmitted in the same fashion that any other prescription is transmitted, by paper prescription or by electronic means. Yeah, just directly to your neighborhood pharmacy. It's astounding. And I have to say, oh, excuse me, Cardinal, the pharmacists are not happy about this.
Right,
They
you hit
are,
on something
you
there
know,
with
we've been
pharmacists.
talking about physicians and nurses and other caregivers, but think about the dispensing pharmacist.
I'm sure.
And I don't know
And
how they get out
I
of it.
don't think there's any conscience clause that covers the pharmacists.
That's
And
right.
the doctors in Oregon tell us now, 10 years later, the pressure is now on the doctors to make them refer if they don't want to poison the patient themselves. And in other words, involving them in the process. So the conscience clause is not something that's guaranteed in perpetuity, and the pharmacists don't even have that kind of legal protection by this law.
Okay, obviously a lot to talk about. We have to go to our second break right now. In our next segment, our panelists will respond to key arguments of those in favor of question 2. Please stay with us.
Our family has spanned the centuries and the globe. With God's grace, we started hospitals to care for the sick. We established orphanages and help the poor. We are the largest charitable organization on the planet, bringing comfort to those in need. We educate more children than any other institution. We developed the scientific method and founded the college system. We defend the dignity of human life and uphold marriage. Guided by the Holy Spirit, we compiled the Bible. We are transformed by sacred scripture and sacred tradition, which have guided us for 2,000 years. We are the Catholic Church, with over 1 billion in our family, sharing in the sacraments and fullness of the Christian faith. Jesus started our church when he said to Peter, the first pope, "You are rock, and upon this rock I will build my church." So if you've been away from the Catholic Church, we invite you to take another look. Visit CatholicsComeHome.org today. We are Catholic. Welcome home.
Thank you for joining us for this live town hall meeting on Catholic TV and 1060 AM WQOM. We're considering the question of assisted suicide. In this segment, our third, we'll ask our panelists to respond to questions involving arguments for those in favor of question 2. There are 2 leading proponents of assisted suicide in Oregon, the state of Washington, and in more than 20 other states where assisted suicide legislation has been introduced and failed to become law, and now also here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They are the organizations called Compassion and Choices, formerly the Hemlock Society, and the organization Death with Dignity. Their local website is dignity2012.org. On that website, proponents advance the idea that question 2 would give panelists dignity, control, and peace of mind during their final days with family and loved ones. They say it expands end-of-life care options for terminally ill patients. They also argue that it respects and upholds the integrity of the doctor-patient relationship, and that question 2 contains strict safeguards to ensure that the patient is making a voluntary and an informed decision. So let's pose our first question on this idea to MC Sullivan. MC, proponents say this is about autonomy and control at the end of life, that individuals should have the option of assisted suicide. Tell us the issues around assisted suicide being available for those who do want it.
There are 2 layers of concerns that I have about this. The first is that every healthcare decision is based on autonomy and informed consent. And as I said earlier, I won't reiterate all of the arguments. This initiative does not rise to the level of knowing that patients are fully informed, that there's a way to know that they're informed, and that they understand all the available options of palliative care in particular, but others as well. Hospice care, more rigorous pain management. There's an allusion to pain management information and hospice information. That may be, because it's not stipulated in the bill, something as simple as pick up a brochure on your way out of the office or go to such and such website. So there's that problem. But the other problem is that we are very social and relational beings, and when more than at the time of our dying ought relationships to have some part in the process. Those people upon whom we've depended, whom we've loved, who have supported us. The idea of celebrating and lifting up autonomy as though it's the be-all and end-all is slightly dangerous. It ignores relationship. It ignores the naturally built-in checks and balances that we as thinking and deciding human beings have.
And you know, that brings me to a question I want to ask Cardinal Sean about this issue. Proponents often articulate, Your Eminence, highly emotional stories of individuals who just want the option to end their life. What's the best response to those types of arguments to point out that suicide impacts more than just the patient requesting that lethal prescription?
It does, and they may feel that some people will have greater freedom because of this law. But many people, their freedom will be diminished. There's such danger here of elder abuse, and many people are going to be made to feel that they're selfish or unreasonable if they don't commit suicide. And so rather than augmenting people's freedom, we're in a very subtle way undermining people's freedom for the many good options that they could choose.
Okay. And we have a question from the audience here. If you would just say your name, tell us where you're from, and please pose your question.
Sure. My name is Fran Hogan, and I'm from Everett. I have a question about the terrible flaws in this bill, one of which strikes me as really weird and that no one seems to have mentioned it. I'm a lawyer, and as a lawyer I often draft wills for people. And when one drafts a will in Massachusetts, both witnesses must be disinterested. They cannot be your heir. Yet, that's property. This is life, and yet one of those witnesses could be your heir who will benefit when you are killed, basically. And I think that that's a flaw of the bill. People who may not agree with us on these life issues, the sacredness of life, should see the terrible flaws that this bill contains in terms of protection, as you've all said.
Anyone care to comment? Janet?
In fact, the 2 witnesses don't have to know the patient at all. There is no requirement that this would be like being in a bank and asking for someone to witness when you're having something notarized. So they don't have to know the patient. And one of them has to not be an heir, which means that one of them may be an heir and actually benefit from the death of the person. There also is a permission in this bill that a surrogate may ask for suicide, someone who's familiar with the patient's mode of communicating if that patient can't communicate in the normal way. So if grandma bats her eyes twice in order to say yes, a surrogate may say that grandma has indicated in that way that she would like to end her life. It is an insidious bill, as our audience has pointed out.
Okay, thank you, Janet.
To
Cardinal?
me, the scariest part of the bill, when you read it over, there's a lot of protections for the people that are promoting the suicide and very little protection for the individual who's being killed. And as I say, with the danger of elder abuse in our society, people should be very, very cautious of this.
Okay, and we have
That's
an
an excellent point. What this bill does legally is it protects physicians from being prosecuted for helping patients commit suicide. It really doesn't help patients. What it's doing is trying to protect physicians. Please don't help us with that.
Right. Yeah, good point on all of you. We have a question from somebody who's viewing at home and email. Let's just take a look at this. And we can pose this to get our audience from home involved. The question is it only Catholics who are opposed to this? And why should a Catholic issue influence state law? Anyone care
I'd love
take
to
it?
speak to that.
Please do.
Because there are some folks here, I think, who would agree with me despite their positions and their day jobs. This is not a religious issue. Absolutely, for many of us, principles and values and teachings of our faith community are at play. But this is a human rights issue. This is a patient protection issue. This is a consumer protection issue. This bill, regardless of how you feel about assisted suicide, is a bad bill. It's poorly crafted and it's dangerous. You know, I referred earlier to the romantic notion that people have that some patients will just kind of drift off and be very happy. The mechanics of doing this medication, this prescribed lethal dose, are actually quite difficult to carry out. And the physician is not there holding your hand. The physician assistance comes in transmitting the prescription. So this can be a very lonely and ripe for abuse, as I said earlier, kind of way to see patients die.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes, so I just want to go through, and if everyone would care to answer or make a comment, please feel free. But the audience at home, the people here in the audience tonight, what's the best argument against this that you could put forth so people can leave here with some idea of how to oppose this and tell friends and family why they should not vote for it? Father Tad, you want to start?
Well, I think the core question we always have to ask ourselves, whenever we choose to do something that's wrong or disordered, what's often going on in the background? We're taking something that's good and we're treating it as if it's an evil. And that's exactly what's happening here. We're treating the good of life as if it's an evil, as if it's something to be done away with, as if it's something hurtful. You know, I mean, you can think of similar analogies, to use a rather strong one, if I might. People who, in the old days in Rome, when they had vomitoriums, people would transform their own eating, which is clearly a good, to help nourish us and make us strong. They would treat our eating as an evil and go and vomit the food that they had just eaten. That's always a disordered kind of human choice. And assisted suicide is similarly treating something very good, the most precious good of all, as if it were an evil, and is a choice consequently that we should not ever make.
Okay. Janet?
I would like to go back to the issue we were talking about earlier about families. Imagine being the spouse or the child of someone who has made this choice and not having been consulted. What a terrible thing that is. A friend of mine said to me, this is almost something that families cannot bear. And I ask people to consider that and to speak to everyone they know and ask them if they know about the ballot initiative and do they know what the flaws in this bill really are.
Okay. Dr. John, we have about 45 seconds, so between you and MC.
Yeah. I would just ask everyone here in the audience tonight and at home, perhaps some of you are dealing with terminal illness and know the sorrow and the suffering that entails. Suicide sometimes seems like a good option, and I would urge anyone who's thinking about that tonight to reach out for help. There are much better alternatives. Hospice care and palliative care. Go to your doctor and ask for help. Let's not put into place a way of committing suicide in our state.
Okay. MC, if you could wrap it up.
I would like to wrap it up by saying, regardless of how your neighbors and your perhaps family members feel about this bill and the principle, rather, of assisted suicide, this particular initiative is dangerous. It's ripe for abuse, it's poorly crafted, and I think we have to reject it out of hand.
Okay, and we're going to let you have the last word, Cardinal Sean, but I first want to say thank you to everyone tonight who posed questions from the audience, to everyone at home. And Cardinal Sean, please make some closing remarks for us.
Thank you, John, and I thank everyone for tuning in to this important discussion. I encourage all of you to stay tuned immediately after this broadcast for the beginning of a special Rosary Novena to pray for the defeat of assisted suicide here in Massachusetts, and to pray the Rosary for each of these 9 days until October the 11th. We cannot ignore the impending legalization of physician-assisted suicide as if it did not affect us. It would bring spiritual death, a cheapening of human life, and a corrupting of the medical profession. Physician-assisted suicide means making the pharmacists, the doctors, nurses, family members, friends, and society itself accomplices in a suicide. Our task is to help prevent suicide and provide the very best palliative and hospice care for our terminally ill loved ones. You will hear many emotional arguments in favor of assisted suicide. We all get emotional when we talk about the death of those whom we love the most. Laws must not be born out of emotion. Laws need to reflect the moral law, the common good, and the protection of the most vulnerable. Ballot question 2 is a bad law because it puts vulnerable people at risk and it promotes suicide. We are asking all of you participating in this broadcast this evening to help in this very challenging time. We feel confident that if the voters have a chance to hear about the flaws of this proposed legislation, they will vote no on question 2. It all hinges on our ability to get the message out. Please share with your family, friends, neighbors, and co-workers some of the many reasons that medical organizations, disability groups, hospice and palliative care professionals, and people like you are voting no on question 2. You can do this personally or through email or social media. Great resources to help you do this well are available at suicideIsAlwaysAtragedy.org and at stopassistedsuicide.org. I would not be asking this of you if it were not so crucial. I would hope that each of us would try to reach at least 10 people with these flaws on question 2. This is not a partisan policy. It's simply exercising our right to contribute to the exchange of ideas that the constitutions of the United States guarantees. The Church performs an important service by weighing in on moral and ethical issues. Many people objected to Archbishop Romero's advocating for the poor and objected to Reverend Martin Luther King's work on behalf of social justice. They both gave their lives to make their countries better places where human dignity was respected. We are all called to work for a more just society where the weak and the vulnerable are nurtured and protected. Our faith demands that we not be guilty bystanders. And that's why I'm asking you to join me and partner with so many others to stop assisted suicide by voting no on question 2 on Election Day.
And a special thanks to you, Cardinal Sean, for convening this town hall meeting, and a thank you to all of our panelists. We appreciate your time. The discussion tonight's an important one for every voter in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as we prepare to cast our ballots on November 6th. This town hall meeting will be rebroadcast 16 times here on Catholic TV and CatholicTV.com between now and Election Day, so please encourage others to tune in. For everyone at Catholic TV and WQOM, I'm John Monahan. Good night from Boston.